Hi, my name's Alyssa Morea. My presentation for medical geography will be on high blood pressure. Today I'll be introducing our topic while also examining a case study on the geographic distribution of high blood pressure in Germany. High blood pressure. It's a medical condition where the blood pressure in arteries is elevated. High blood pressure is measured, as seen in the left picture, when doctors compress your arm and count your pulse. This condition can be difficult to spot because there are no symptoms caused, but its presence is a major risk factor associated with many cardiovascular diseases, stroke, vision loss, kidney disease, and even dementia. There are two classifications of high blood pressure, primary and secondary. The vast majority are primary, and this is limited to cases due to non-point specific lifestyle and genetic factors. Lifestyle risks can include obesity, smoking, and alcohol consumption. Secondary is more rare, making up only about 10% of cases, and has a point-specific source, such as an underlying disease, disorder, or medication. So high blood pressure is far from an emerging disease. Instances pointing towards the condition can be dated back to 2600 BCE, but back then it was called hard pulse disease. Hard pulse was a consequence of consuming too much salt, and that was all they really knew about it. While ancient scientists were progressive in recognizing the association, effective treatment was not yet there. Ancient treatment included acupuncture and bloodletting. The condition can be seen again in ancient times in the Ebers Papyrus, where it was noted that a raised pulse was linked to heart and brain issues. So you see, we're finally making progress. But now, in more modern medicine, we've discovered the fundamentals of the condition that we still use today. The biggest advancements have been made in the past 100 years when medical professionals began to really define the condition. The condition became widely known due to President FDR on the right, who suffered from it. The president ended up dying of a hemorrhagic stroke while also suffering from hypertension. After his death, there was a new emphasis on drug treatments for it. Today, more than 90% of cases can be controlled through medication. So high blood pressure, it's also known as hypertension. Hypertension can typically be alleviated through lifestyle changes and medications. Healthy lifestyle changes include exercise, weight loss, and reduced alcohol consumption. Blood pressure medications are also a common way to treat the condition while also decreasing the risk of health complications. While the benefits of treatment are that it typically will not trigger the risk factors, another benefit is a greater life expectancy. So some quick stats are just that it affects nearly half of all adults in the US, or they're at least taking medication for it. And of that, only 25% have it under control, despite the fact that it could be potentially really easy to take care of. And fiscally, high blood pressure costs the US about $131 billion each year. So now we're looking at the geographic distribution. In the US, more southern states have higher rates of blood pressure. And if you compare rates, the map of obesity in the US is nearly the same as that of hypertension. I don't think that's a coincidence. As we heard earlier, there is a strong connection between them. Other socioeconomic factors could be in effect to blame why the distribution is how it is. Could also be physiological or psychological. And that's something our case study looks at a little. While globally not everywhere has data on this, it could be possible that the same disparities that cause the distribution to look how it does in the US could be set internationally. So the study we'll be looking at is a cross-sectional analysis of the effects of residential greenness on blood pressure in 10-year-old children. The authors are listed here, and the study was published in the Biomed Central Public Health Journal. So what is the objective? The objective of the study is to investigate the effects of green spaces on blood pressure using an observational design. The foundation for this study came from Ulrich's theory of psychoevolutionary theory that humans are better physiologically and psychologically adapted to natural settings than urban industrialized settings. Because of this, nature leads to reduced stress and a balanced heart rate and blood pressure. Through this study, the authors aim to explore the habitat vertex and see relationships between the natural versus built environment. So how does this all translate to an actual experiment? As we look at the methodology, this study is a cross-sectional study. This kind of study is done through observation, And during that observation, we examine the outcome and exposure at the same time, rather than chronologically or retrospectively assigning different exposures or case and controls. So, within that methodology, we need to take a closer look at the design of the study, like why 10-year-olds? Children are a useful study population because they're not as prone to take medications that can influence blood pressure as adults normally are. They also don't have other risk factors that we saw earlier, like alcohol consumption or smoking habits. 10 years is just a good standard baseline for a follow-up. Children were found through existing studies, those existing studies being German infant study on the influence of nutrition intervention plus environmental and genetic influences on allergy development, thus the Ginny plus from the title, and the influence of lifestyle factors on the development of the immune system and allergies in East and West Germany, plus the influence of traffic emissions in genetics, which is the Lisa plus from the original title. These studies recruited only healthy full-term newborns to minimize any underlying health issues as confounding variables. At the time of follow-up, home address, blood pressure, and covariate data were collected. So looking at the study area, Munich and Wesel are shown in the map of Germany. Wesel is the red dot on the western coast, and Munich is on the southeastern coast. Analyses for the study were required to stay in the study areas from birth to the 10-year follow-up. From Munich, 1,256 participants were accounted for, and in Wesel, 822 participants. The gender breakdown was about even in both cities. The covariate data that was collected was used as a method to standardize study populations and areas in later analyses. Otherwise, these factors would have been considered confounding variables that are other environmental stressors. These include things like temperature, altitude, level of urbanization, air pollution, and raw traffic noise annoyance. Looking more closely at the study area, the authors used ArcGIS and geospatial modeling environment software. To assess the greenness, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI, was used. NDVI is a common reference tool for analyzing green vegetation through surface reflection measurements. It's based on differences on readings of near infrared and visible red. The image to the left shows the NDVI scale used throughout the study. -1 is for areas with dead plants or no plants, so areas like a really urban city that are mainly cement. But for this study, any negative values were not included. A +1 is the opposite and applies to areas with lush greenery. The scale was applied to Munich and Wesel through satellite imaging of the area taken on cloud-free summer days in 2003. Residential greenness was defined as the average NDVI of a circular 500-meter buffer. 500 meters was chosen as the buffer to be a proxy of a child's neighborhood and would be accessible in about 10 minutes of walking, since children aren't as mobile as adults. The results are shown on the maps. The map to the left is Wesel and the right Munich. They show the spatial distribution among participants with different colors for participants depending on the NDVI scale. Kids living in Wesel had statistically significantly higher mean blood pressure compared to those in Munich. The participants in Wesel also differed in other ways, like they had higher BMIs and were from families of lower socioeconomic status, both of which could cause the higher BP, blood pressure. Wesel was a more rural area with higher average NDVI values, whereas Munich was more urbanized. Crude and adjusted associations were similar in trends. Children residing in areas with low levels of greenness had higher blood pressure compared to those living in areas of moderate and high levels of greenness, and those living in areas of moderate greenness had higher blood pressure than those in high levels of greenness. Looking at the covariate factors, BMI, sex, and parental hypertension had significant effects. Thus, lower levels of residential greenness were positively associated with higher blood pressure in 10-year-old German children that we conclude. This is independent of potential other environmental factors. or stressors. So now, what was wrong with this study? So this study serves as a good baseline for what could be expected in future studies, but it is far from perfect and there's much more to be studied. This association should be further studied with different age groups and locations, especially areas with differing levels of urbanization, to confirm the relationship rather than leave it up to chance. It'd be interesting to see more studies examining socioeconomic levels and considering more of the time spent in and out of the standard buffer zones. Other inherent limitations are due to the study design, like cross-sectional studies typically suffer from selection bias. Other limitations could come from discrepancies when measuring blood pressure, and other studies could also examine different ways of measuring greenery, as NDVI only considers green plants specifically. As you can see listed here are my references. Thank you for your time, and please feel free to reach out for further questions.